The title of my reflection today is This Reminds Me of a Story. In thinking about this month's theme of story, well, the first question that came to mind was, what exactly is a story? What's the difference between stories and gossip? Or, stories and news and lectures, history, or even just having a conversation? Certainly, stories have a much more positive connotation for us than do those kinds of communicating information. And all those telling ways do have their place. I learned that central to the idea of story is getting a listener's attention and then transporting that listener into a setting. So I then felt like I had a better understanding of the definition of story, but I was still floundering as to what are the value of stories to our community. And then I remembered when Rabbi Moshe Hen was the guest worship lead for UUSM in June, multiple times during his sermon, he said, "That reminds me of a story." Yeah. Everyone's laughing because he said it more than once for sure. And we all know intuitively that stories and sermons work really well to engage our attention. I communicated with him and he was able to tell me that he uses stories to convey information better than ideas offered as just facts without context. And this became central to my understanding of how stories fit into our lives. Scientists have demonstrated that when a story transports us into the setting, it actually has an impact on our brain. And the better the storytelling, the more response in our brains. Like when we ourselves tense up during the part of a story with a tricky rescue, or when we laugh out loud at an unusual image. When our brains are engaged like this, the information is better remembered. Rabbi Moshe gave me another clue as well. He mentioned that storytelling is central to Jewish tradition. Jews are a storytelling people, and storytelling is an essential aspect of Judaism. And Jews have stories that are central to their own identity, but they also have stories for the wider community in the world. So I read an article by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs on storytelling in Judaism, and he wrote, "We are the story we tell about ourselves. This is an intrinsic, perhaps necessary link between narrative and identity. We come to know who we are by discovering of which story or stories we are a part. We are the story that we tell about ourselves." This idea applies not just to individuals, as you'll hear in Kathy's reflection, but to organizations and cultures as well. And I related this idea to myself because I'm learning about Unitarian Universalism. I'm new to this whole thing. And I find that stories work better for me than the facts. So what stories do I already have on hand when someone asks now me, so what is this Unitarian Universalism all about, right? What is it that I can say rather than reciting the 8 principles? I want to give context. So one story that comes to mind is from the service Reverend Tovis led in June, where she was retelling a story originally from Mark D. Morrison Reed, who in fact was retelling a story that he had heard. That reminds me of a story. And the story was about God pulling the last unrepentant sinner kicking and screaming into heaven. Like, what a great way to tell other people that you see a person's worth and value, and they believe in a radical and overpowering love, all in that simple story. It really struck me, and I've actually gotten to use it more than once. And it's like, that reminds me of a story I heard in the service in June. Another story that I've already gotten to use is the history behind the UU Flower Communion that we celebrated in May. That was, I think it was the 100th birthday, and so we were looking into the history. The idea behind the flowers of the bouquet is that it represents beauty and diversity of the congregation and the individuals as a whole and as separate. And that really resonated with what I see here at UUSM, beautiful individuals and a beautiful community. But I also had a surprising emotional connection to this story. It begins in Prague in 1923, when the idea was first developed. My father was born in 1923 in Pilsen, which is very close to Prague. So it really connected with me, and we now know that when emotions are evoked, whatever they are, the story is better remembered. And I continue to look for stories about UU values to expand my understanding. And I recently came across an article in UU World called Of Sandbars and Circuit Riders. And it presented stories from the Universalist tradition. And there was a striking image of rough-hewn circuit-riding ministers debating theology as they rode. Hosea Ballou was one such rider. He converted to Universalism in 1789, and he's considered the father of American Universalism. And the story goes that he was riding with a Baptist preacher who said, "Brother Ballou, if I were a Universalist and feared not the fires of hell, I would hit you over the head. I would steal your horse and saddle and ride away with them, and I would still go to heaven." And Hosea Ballou looked over at him and said, "Well, if you were a Universalist, that idea would never occur to you." So I was certainly transported by the story, and I could almost hear those horses' hooves on the rocks, on the rough paths, as the men talked with each other as they went along. And going back to that idea of knowing who we are by discovering the stories of which we are a part, this is what I want to be part of. I want to be the Unitarian Universalist that wouldn't even think of that kind of violence. So in October, as part of the transitional work that Reverends Tovis and Terry will be doing, we'll be exploring UUSM's own story. This will involve lots of storytelling. By understanding the stories of the congregation, we hope to better understand its present state. I look forward to learning from those stories, and I will continue to collect stories from UU and other faith traditions as well as they illustrate my own values. And then I plan to have a large cache of stories ready, and I'll be pulling out examples of what I believe and how I want to live my life. So once upon a time, there was an ordinary woman standing before a UU congregation, struggling to impart a joyful, hopeful message. And she says, "That reminds me of a story."